The day my father died, my brother got a house on Lake Ontario with a wraparound deck and a boat slip. I got a 40-acre parcel of scrubland 2 hours north of Thunder Bay that nobody had touched in 30 years. My wife found out at the reading of the will. We were sitting in the lawyer's office on a Tuesday afternoon in February. The kind of cold that makes your nose hairs freeze the second you step outside. And the lawyer read the document in that flat, professional voice they use when they've seen too many families fall apart in that same chair. My brother sat across the table with his hands folded, already knowing. I found that out later. He already knew. When the lawyer finished, my wife looked at me the way you look at someone who has just embarrassed you in public, not angry. Worse than angry. Disappointed. Like she'd been patient for 34 years and this was the confirmation she'd been waiting for. She didn't say anything until we were in the car. Then she said, "Your father never respected you, and apparently neither did the will." I didn't answer. I stared at the ice on the windshield and thought about the fact that my father had shaken my brother's hand at Christmas, just 6 weeks before he died. He'd shaken his hand and said, "You've done well, son." He said my brother's name. He didn't say mine. My name is Vernon. I'm 63 years old. I worked 31 years as a land surveyor for the province of Ontario. I am not a flashy man. I have never owned a boat or been on a ski trip or worn a suit that cost more than $300. My brother went into commercial real estate in his late 20s, and by 45 he had a condo in Yorkville and a reputation for knowing which neighborhoods were about to turn. People at family dinners asked him questions. They asked me to pass the potatoes. The land my father left me was in a township called Coldstream Ridge, which barely qualified as a name on a map. The parcel had been in our family since the 1970s. My father bought it for almost nothing. Logging rights had expired, there was no road frontage worth mentioning, and the soil was too thin and rocky for farming. He talked about building a cabin there someday. He never did. After he stopped talking about the cabin, he stopped talking about the land entirely. My brother called it the bush lot. He'd been calling it that for years, the way you name something to diminish it. "Dad still got that bush lot up north," he'd say at family gatherings, and people would nod and move on. After the will was read, he called me that same evening. He was gracious about it. That's the word I kept thinking. Gracious. He said he hoped I wasn't disappointed, that Dad had wanted the lake property to stay in one piece, and it just made more sense to keep it with one person, that he was sure I'd figure something out with the land, that he was always available if I wanted to talk through options. I said thank you and hung up. My wife had moved to the guest room by then. Not dramatically. She just stopped coming to bed. I'd wake up at 2 in the morning and the other side would be cold, and I'd lie there in the dark listening to the house settle and thinking about 40 acres of scrubland that I'd never even walked. She said, a few days after the will, that she thought I should talk to a financial advisor about whether to sell. She said it gently, the way she'd been saying things gently for years, which I had learned meant she'd already made up her mind. I said I wanted to go up and see it first. She looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "What is there to see, Vernon?" I didn't have an answer. That bothered me more than the question. I drove up on a Thursday in March, when the snow was still a foot deep in the shadows, but the roads were clear. I had the legal description my father's lawyer had given me, and I had the old survey maps my father kept in a manila envelope in his filing cabinet. I'd taken the whole cabinet after the estate closed, the one thing I asked for and the one thing nobody else wanted. The land was 40 minutes past the last Tim Hortons on Highway 11, then a left onto a gravel road that wasn't maintained past a certain point, and then another 2 kilometers on what had once been a logging track and was now just a pair of tire ruts through the spruce. I parked where the track ended and walked in. It was quiet, the way the north is quiet. Not peaceful exactly, but indifferent. The trees didn't care that I was there. The cold didn't care. I walked the perimeter roughly, following the boundary pins my father had apparently marked with rebar decades ago, orange flagging tape still clinging to some of them, brittle and faded. It took me most of the afternoon. My boots were wet by noon, and I ate a sandwich standing up against a spruce tree and drank coffee from a thermos. I was cold, and my knees hurt, and I kept thinking about my wife's face in the lawyer's office. But I was a land surveyor, 31 years, and something about the eastern boundary of that property didn't sit right with me. The rebar pins were where they should be. The corners were correct, but there was a cut line running through the eastern third of the property. A straight corridor through the trees, 15 meters wide, cleared at some point and now growing back in scrub brush and young poplar. Cut lines mean something. They don't appear by accident. They're access corridors usually. Pipeline, power, utilities. I took photos. I took compass bearings. I noted the bearing of the corridor and paced its width and wrote everything down in the small notebook I still carry in my jacket pocket, a habit from 30 years of fieldwork. I drove back to Thunder Bay that evening and called an old colleague of mine, a woman I'd worked with at the Provincial Survey's office for years before she retired to do consulting work. I described the cut line. I gave her the bearing and the legal description of the property. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Pull the title. Pull everything. The crown grants, the easements, all of it. Don't do anything until you've pulled everything." I pulled everything. It took me 2 weeks of driving back and forth to the Land Registry office in Thunder Bay and making calls to the Provincial Surveys branch and filing requests under the Freedom of Information Act for documents that should have been easy to find and weren't. My wife thought I was going to grief counseling. I didn't correct her. What I found, buried in a surveyor's field note from 1987 and referenced in a Crown easement registered in 1991, was this. The cut line on my property was a registered corridor for a telecommunications infrastructure easement held by the federal government. It had been granted for the purpose of what the document called National Communications Backbone Routing, and it ran in a straight line for 63 kilometers through that part of northern Ontario, passing directly through the eastern third of my father's property. The easement was still active. It had never been extinguished. And sometime in the early 2000s, I found this in a second set of documents. A fiber optic trunk line had been installed along that corridor as part of a federal broadband infrastructure program. A federally registered easement, active fiber optic infrastructure, running through 40 acres of scrubland that my brother called the bush lot. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of the registry office for a long time after I understood what I was looking at. The easement itself had a compensation schedule attached to it, registered as an amendment in 2003. The original easement from 1991 had been granted when my father owned the land, and he had been paid a nominal amount, $800, for the initial right-of-way. The 2003 amendment, which corresponded to the fiber installation, had a provision for ongoing annual compensation to the landowner at a rate to be assessed under the Federal Telecommunications Act. My father had either never pursued it or never known it applied. The filing was there. The entitlement was there. Nobody had claimed it in over 20 years. I called the federal department named in the document. I was transferred 4 times. I spoke to a man who sounded young and slightly bored and who asked me to hold while he looked up the file. He came back and his voice had changed. He said he'd need to verify ownership through the registry before he could discuss specifics, but that active compensation claims on federal easements were generally processed within 90 days of a verified ownership submission. I asked him, without letting anything into my voice, for a ballpark range on what annual compensation for this class of infrastructure easement might look like. He said he couldn't give specific numbers without a formal assessment. Then he said, generally speaking, for active fiber routing easements of this vintage, annual compensation can be in the range of $70,000 to $120,000 per year, indexed to infrastructure usage. I thanked him and hung up and sat in my truck for another 20 minutes. My brother had been trying to sell the property since January. I found this out from my cousin, who mentioned it at a family dinner I almost didn't attend. My brother had apparently been making calls to a land aggregator who bought rural parcels for timber speculation. He'd gotten an offer of $42,000. The land wasn't his to sell, but my brother had always operated as though things were his simply because he wanted them to be. He had mentioned at the will reading that he thought it would make more sense to deal with the bush lot together and consolidate whatever value was left in the estate. I hadn't understood what he meant at the time. I understood now. I called my own lawyer, a woman I'd used for real estate closings over the years, quiet and precise, the kind of person who reads every footnote, and I told her what I had. She went quiet in the way my old colleague had gone quiet. Then she said, "Do not respond to your brother. Do not respond to any land agents. Don't post anything. Don't discuss this with your wife yet. Let me verify the documents and then we'll talk about next steps." I followed her instructions. It was the hardest 2 weeks of my life. My wife had started making comments about whether we should think about downsizing, whether the house was too much for the two of us at our age. She said it in that careful voice which I had learned over 34 years meant she was preparing me for something she'd already decided. My brother called once. He said a buyer had expressed interest in the north property and that if we moved quickly we might get $55,000, which was better than the market, and that he could handle the paperwork if I just gave him power of attorney. I told him I wasn't ready to make any decisions. He said, in that patient voice he uses when he thinks I'm being slow, "Vernon, it's Scrubland. Nobody's going to develop it. This is found money." I said I understood and that I'd let him know. My lawyer called me the following Tuesday. She had verified the easement through the Federal Registry and confirmed the ownership chain through the provincial land title. She had also spoken informally to a colleague who specialized in telecommunications law. She said, "This is real. The annual compensation entitlement is real. It's been unclaimed since 2003, and you can file a retroactive claim for up to 10 years under the current federal schedule. 10 years of unclaimed compensation at current rates. I'm not going to pretend I didn't do the math in the parking lot of a Canadian Tire in Thunder Bay on a Wednesday afternoon. I did the math 3 times. Then I called my wife. She was at her book club. She stepped outside to take my call, and I could hear the noise of other people behind her, the warm sound of a house with people in it. I said, "I need you to come home tonight. There's something I have to show you." She paused. Then she said, "Is everything all right?" I said, "I think so. I think things are going to be all right." She came home. I had the documents laid out on the kitchen table. The easement registration, the compensation schedule, my lawyer's written summary, the photographs from my site visit with annotations. I walked her through all of it. I used small words. I kept my voice level. When I finished, she sat for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "How long have you known this?" I said, "A few weeks." She looked at the documents. She looked at me. I watched something shift behind her eyes. Not guilt exactly, more like recalibration. She said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I thought about the guest room. I thought about the lawyer's office in February and her voice in the car on the way home. I thought about 34 years of being the man who passed the potatoes. I said, I needed to understand it myself first. The retroactive claim took 4 months to process. My lawyer filed on my behalf in April. The federal department acknowledged the claim in May and requested supporting documentation, which we provided. In August, I received a letter confirming compensation in arrears for the preceding 10 years at the assessed annual rate, plus the ongoing annual payment going forward, indexed annually to a formula tied to network usage and infrastructure classification. The total arrears payment was $411,000. The annual ongoing payment was assessed at $94,000 per year. My brother found out through my cousin, the same way I'd found out he was trying to sell the property. He called me that evening. He was not gracious this time. He said I should have told him. He said we were supposed to be handling things together. He said the estate should have been assessed properly and that he felt he'd been kept out of important information. I let him finish. Then I said, "The land was left to me, not to us. That's what the will says. I didn't make any decisions on your behalf, and I didn't ask you to make any on mine." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was trying to help you. That property was worthless." I said it wasn't, as it turns out. He tried twice more in the following weeks to suggest that the estate had been improperly settled, that the easement compensation should be considered part of the broader estate assets, that a fair family ought to discuss these things. My lawyer sent a brief letter the second time, citing the will and the registered ownership and the fact that the easement rights were an incident of the land itself, not a separate asset. We didn't hear from him again after that. My wife and I went to counseling that fall. Not because she suggested it, and not because I asked. It was mutual, which was maybe the first thing in a long time that had been mutual between us. The counselor was a man in his late 50s with a calm office on the 15th floor of a building in downtown Toronto, and he had the gift of asking questions that sounded simple and weren't. He asked my wife once, in the third or fourth session, what she had believed about me before February. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I believed he was someone who things happened to, not someone who made things happen." The counselor looked at me and didn't say anything. I said, "That's fair." She looked at me then, really looked at me. And she said, "I don't think that anymore. I'm not going to tell you we fixed everything. You don't fix 34 years of being seen a certain way in 6 sessions with a counselor on the 15th floor." But something had shifted. Something real. I still go up to the property twice a year, in the spring when the ice goes out and in the fall before the snow. I walk the boundary the same way I did that first time, checking the pins, checking the cut line, making sure nothing has changed. The young poplar in the corridor has filled in nicely. The federal maintenance crews come through every couple of years to clear it. I've met them twice, friendly guys in orange vests who were surprised to meet the landowner in person. I had a small cabin built on the western end of the property last summer. Nothing extravagant. 2 rooms, a wood stove, a covered porch that faces west. My father always said he was going to build a cabin up there. I don't know why he never did. Maybe he got busy. Maybe he stopped believing it was worth it. I used to think the land was the consolation prize, the thing you get when you're the son who wasn't chosen, the husband who wasn't enough, the brother who didn't make it to Yorkville. I don't think that anymore either. The cranes building the new logistics center outside Thunder Bay are visible on clear days from the ridge at the north end of my property. The region is changing. Fiber infrastructure that was installed for government routing in 2003 now carries commercial traffic as well. And my lawyer tells me there may be grounds for a usage renegotiation in the next renewal cycle. I'm not in a hurry. I have time. I'm 63, not dead. And I've learned something that took me most of my adult life to understand. The people who dismiss something as worthless are usually the ones who never bothered to read past the first page. My father left me 40 acres of scrubland and a cut line through the trees. He left my brother a house on the lake with a boat slip and a wraparound deck. I think, in his way, he knew what he was doing. I've been thinking about what actually happened in that parking lot in Thunder Bay. Not the numbers, not the legal documents, but the moment I sat in my truck and realized I had been looking at my own life the wrong way for a very long time. For 31 years I measured land for a living. I walked boundaries in the rain and drove stakes into frozen ground and wrote things down in notebooks that nobody else ever read. I was good at it. Precise. Patient. And somehow I had never applied any of that to myself, to the question of what I was actually worth, what I actually knew, what I was actually capable of seeing that other people couldn't be bothered to look for. My brother looked at 40 acres of spruce and scrub brush and saw something to be gotten rid of quickly. My wife looked at the same thing and saw confirmation of what she already believed about me. I'm not angry about that anymore. People see what they've decided to see. That's a human failing, not a personal attack. But it's also the reason that doing the quiet, unglamorous work of actually looking, really looking with patience and without ego, matters more than almost anything else. What I found in that cut line wasn't luck. It was the result of 31 years of knowing how to read a landscape, combined with the simple decision to drive up there and walk the boundary myself, instead of letting someone else tell me what it was worth. That decision came from something that doesn't have a flashy name. It was just integrity, the choice to take the thing seriously, even when nobody else did. Even when my own wife had moved to the guest room and my brother was already negotiating a sale. Integrity isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's showing up to the land registry office 4 Tuesdays in a row and filing Freedom of Information requests and reading 1987 field notes until you understand what you're looking at. It's the opposite of what my brother and my wife were doing, which was moving fast on assumptions. The understanding, the actual mental work of connecting a cut line to a federal easement to a compensation schedule, that came from years of caring about the details other people found boring. I used to be embarrassed by that. My brother could walk into a room and make people feel like the future was happening right now. I was the one who went home and read the fine print. I thought that made me small. I know now it made me right. And the part nobody talks about, the part that actually cost something, was the weeks of sitting with what I knew and not telling anyone. Not reacting when my brother called about the sale. Not correcting my wife's assumptions about where I was going in the mornings. Holding the information carefully until my lawyer had verified every piece of it. That required a kind of steadiness I didn't know I had. You find out what you're made of, not when things are going well, but when you know something important and every instinct is telling you to speak too soon. I built a cabin on the western end of that property last summer. 2 rooms and a wood stove and a porch that faces west. My father always said he was going to do the same thing and never did. I think about that sometimes. About what stops people from doing the thing they always said they were going to do. I don't think it's laziness usually. I think it's the accumulated weight of being told in small ways over many years that what you see isn't quite right, that your judgment isn't quite reliable, that you better wait for someone else to confirm it before you act. I stopped waiting. That's the whole story.